So welcome everybody to this month's the Contact Center Network, and we've got a great session lined up today with some awesome speakers, and we're talking today about customer experience, and I thought it'd be useful just to share my view of the world in terms of customer experience and where some of that plays in kind of some of the work that I do. And we focus on customer experience in probably 4 different ways, really. And I'm not going to go on too much about this because there is a document that I'm sharing with everybody at the end, which gives you some hints and tips about how to create a more practical customer experience. But when we look at customer experience, and we're going to start to talk about all these as we go throughout the next 12 months, as we're looking at how people, process, technology, and leadership play a part in helping us to develop a really great customer experience. And I think the part that we're talking about today, we're kind of starting on the, I suppose, the broader context of how we can start to shape some of that and using experience from some awesome guest panelists that we've got on the call today. And we're going to look at some of the questions that we've got around who owns customer experience, what customer experience is like post-COVID, and how can we balance some of that operational metric with actually the delivery of what is a good customer experience. So agenda for today, but before I do that, I want you to familiarize yourself with the chat, and I want to use this. We've got 30 something people on the call today, and all of you guys work in the industry, in either the contact center industry or the customer service industry or the customer experience world. So I want us to share some really good intelligence today with everybody in terms of what is your best piece of advice when it comes to delivering a great customer experience. And what I'm going to do is all the stuff that goes into the chat today, I'm going to share that in the post-event email so we can share all the tips and share all the great pieces of advice that we get from everybody that's on the call today. So we're going to go through the agenda, which is a little bit of networking. So as I've said, share some of your hints and tips into the chat, share some of your links into the chat just so you can get to know people. So if you're not connected on places like LinkedIn, let's get connected and let's support and help each other at this time. I've got a couple of guest panelists which I'll introduce in a short second. Then we'll look at doing a bit of a post-event survey just to get your thoughts and feelings on other topics that you'd like to see in the Contact Center Network, because this is all about you guys and kind of the stuff that you want to hear and what kind of brings you to this session. You're giving up an hour of your time each month, so we want to make sure that that adds value. And then I'll give you a sneaky preview as to who's joining us for the March event, which will be on the 25th of March, 1 till 2. To introduce, there we go, there's our first talk of the day. Just to introduce our guest panelists for today, I've got the awesome Elaine Lee from Reynolds Busby Lee. And I'll let Elaine introduce herself in just a moment. And then we've also got the amazing Victoria, who joined the Contact Center Network events before and now runs her own consultancy through Orange Falcon Consultancy. And again, I'll let Victoria introduce herself. But manning the chat today, we have Sarah Taverner, who's part of the charity that Fab Solutions supports, which is the Minds Advisory Group, saving lives and building better futures. What better mission statement for a charity than that? And Sarah's going to be in the chat, just trying to encourage people to ask their questions, share their thoughts, share their experiences, because this is about kind of sharing all the things that are maybe your burning platforms and your issues, so that we can bring a little bit of thought leadership to the contact center industry and help support with anything that maybe is on your mind, or anything that you want to share, or any ideas that you're thinking about, or anything that might be of help. This is a really great and safe environment to kind of share some of that stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to introduce my first guest and let you introduce yourself. And it's Elaine Lee. So Elaine, say hello and introduce yourself, and then we'll come to the second guest, which is Victoria Hamilton. So Elaine, over to you.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, I'm Elaine Lee, and I'm Managing Director for a consultancy that specialises in customer experience and the inclusion of customers in employment services, Reynolds Busby Lee. I worked in my first half of my career client side, selling all sorts of products and services from energy, wine, hosiery, entertainment products, all sorts of different things. And I was responsible for running inbound, outbound and customer services initially in the UK, then into Europe, and then across the globe. And since 2005, I've been working with clients, helping them understand how to get their heads around customer experience, what does it mean, and working with them so that they hear the voices of their customers.
Amazing, thank you very much. That's a wealth of experience, that, Elaine. So hopefully there's lots of stuff that you'll be able to share with us today. And if anybody's got any questions on any of the experiences that Elaine's just shared, stick them into the chat and let's ask those questions. Victoria, welcome to the Contact Centre Network. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks, Gary. Delighted to be here today. I've been at a few of these sessions in the past and always found them really informative and great networking. So hopefully today's will be the same. As Gary mentioned, I am the MD and founder of Orange Falcon Consulting, a business I set up right in the midst of the global pandemic last year. I figured when everything else was up in the air, why not throw some further challenge into the mix. Prior to that, I've worked in the field of customer experience and people experience for the last 20 years with brands including John Lewis, HSBC, O2, Scottish Power. So I've got a wealth of experience across different industry sectors. And I really found it quite easy to move across industry sectors because ultimately for me, it all comes down to customers and how businesses are set up to best support and deliver on their customer experience and expectations. So it felt as good a time as any to look at how I can export that knowledge and experience and bring that to bear in a consultancy setup. So I'm working currently in an associate capacity with 3 other consultancies, and I've had initial assignments including the design of a customer care operating model for a global foods business. So exciting times, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that, Victoria. Love to have both you and Elaine on the session today. So today's format is slightly different than we normally do, and normally what we do is we share some presentations and get the speakers to kind of share some value. We're going to do that slightly differently today. We'll get equally as much value, but what we've tried to do for today's session is make it more of a Q&A. So I have lined up some questions for the panel. I'll probably have my own views and thoughts on some of the questions, so I might chime in and add my 2 pence. But I think the important part for today is anybody on the call, if you've got any questions, if you've got any thoughts, or you want to share anything that's kind of happening in your world that is adding value to the customer experience, or any thoughts or initiatives that have worked particularly well during COVID, or stuff that's kind of happening post-COVID when we actually get to post-COVID, please do feel free to share. And what we'll do is we'll bring you onto the speaker. We'll ask you to take yourself off mute and ask your question of either to myself, Victoria, Elaine, or just share what your thought and reflection is on some of the comments that you're hearing today. So let's try and make this as interactive as possible. Sarah's going to be manning the chat, so if you do have a question, just for ease, hashtag question into the chat and type your question, and then we can quickly whittle through the chat and just kind of pull you onto the stage and ask your question. But to start off with, I have some pre-prepared Blue Peter, here's some I wrote earlier questions that I want to kind of ask both Elaine and Victoria. So my first question, and this is no surprise, it's how has COVID changed customer experience, do you think, in, I suppose, the last 12 months? And I did have an order in which I was going to ask you before, and I've forgotten entirely. So I'm going to come to Victoria first and ask Victoria, how do you think COVID's changed customer experience in maybe the last 12 months?
Oh, wow, what an opening question. I mean, just a crazy year on so many fronts. I don't think any risk register in the land would have predicted the impact and longevity of the COVID pandemic. So I think, you know, looking at customers, regardless of the product or service that's been provided, regardless of the sector that they're engaging with, they've been affected and impacted in so many facets of their life. They've had worries about perhaps their own health, their health and well-being of loved ones. They've perhaps had financial worries, job security worries, and just basically, as we're also well aware, basic liberties that we've taken for granted for all of our lives up until now have really just been called into question and been placed out of bounds. So I think first and foremost, it's really important to just really pause and recognise the wide-reaching effect that this pandemic has had on customers in so many aspects of their lives. So what was important to them in life pre-pandemic is unlikely to be as important in life post-pandemic. So it's really important to really pause, understand that voice of the customer, understand that change in customer sentiment, and then understand the implications of that change in expectations on your business and the products and services that you offer. I think there's obviously some key trends which have emerged in the last month, which really apply quite consistently across different sectors. I can see in the comments someone's actually called out the real importance from a customer perspective in terms of that human connection. So critical when we're looking at contact centres, marrying up that human connection and human experience with the explosion of digital tools and tech, making sure that you understand the customer journeys where that human connection is really critical and where that customer is needing that extra reassurance and support. I think also another key theme which has emerged is just the wider notion of choice and flexibility. Customers have engaged new tools, new channels in a way that's never really been experienced before. So it's important that we stay abreast of that change in customer appetite and change in customer comfort level of interacting with brands across different channels, but also recognise which channels are most appropriate for different parts of customer journeys. And I think when businesses are embracing so many different channels, it's so critical that the customer is truly at the heart of that design, that you've got that single view of customers across these different channels, so that the effort isn't put on the customer's domain to keep repeating what particular problems or issues they have, that companies actually have that view and they're able to seamlessly help customers move across different channels. And I think there's also a wider consideration now. I know it came out in a recent Deloitte report looking at the factors that customers most take into account when they're looking to interact with a brand, and trust is just so critical now. And that's not just down to the product and service, but customers are also applying, I think, a much broader lens when they're looking at companies that they want to interact with. And that lens will include what sort of reputation has the business built up in terms of how it's supported its colleagues and employees through the pandemic, how has it supported its wider supply chain. So I think that whole concept of the wider sort of social footprint that a business is leaving is definitely playing much more significance in the decision-making process that customers go through. So yeah, lots to consider. I think the important thing is to recognise that it's had a material impact, and what was important this time last year, not to assume that that is still as important as we move into 2021, that things have changed. So take that time to access your different channels, look at your data, look at your insights, speak to your customers, speak to your people, and put all these pieces of the jigsaw together to really understand, well, this is the so what's the now what in terms of our response as a business and how we move forward from this.
I think you've touched on some really important points there, Victoria. I think the single view of the customer is a really important one, and the digitization of the customer's footprint and how we respond to that is a really interesting one. And I think we'll come back onto those points in just a minute. And it's great to see that the chat is already alive with questions, which is great. And we're gonna touch on one about vulnerability that one of the chaps has put through into the section in a second. But Elaine, before we move on to that vulnerability question, because I think you'd be a really great person to add a lens onto that. What's your view and how things changed in COVID times, and how do you think things might change in post-COVID with customer experience?
So for me, and what I've seen at the beginning last March, probably it's almost 12 months ago, there was a mad scramble to try and get operation functioning in some way whatsoever, and whatever was possible was deemed to be good enough at the beginning. And that led to a massive acceleration for organisations moving to online self-service support. But of course, that left and created a real problem for customers in vulnerable circumstances, because they are not, we don't have a fully 100% digital access in the UK. And the ONS back in 2019 was saying it was about 10% of the population were classed to be in a digitally vulnerable circumstance. I was looking at a report yesterday, which has now upped that number to about 11.9 million, which is just shy of 20%. And that's not necessarily that they don't have access to the internet, but that might be financial limitations in terms of they're perhaps on pay as you go, and therefore data charges coming through, or they've got one laptop or one phone between a family of 5 or 6. And so whilst there is one in the household, not everybody can have constant access. So I think that's thrown up a problem for us that we need to tackle, and quickly. And I think the other thing for me, Victoria talked brilliantly and eloquently about lots of things that I've mentioned, but I think the other thing I would throw into the mix here keep conversation moving is around staff. Is actually by introducing that work from home model, we've now got staff working in isolation, and that they need to be supported, and that they need to be understood, and they need to be communicated with, and we're having to change our business processes and practices to enable that to happen. And at the moment, at the beginning, it was all kind of sticky tape, sticky back plastic, string and glue holding things together. But if we're going to continue working in that framework, with some working in the office, some working from home, then we have to have some permanent solutions.
And I think it's really interesting that you touch on the impact on agents in the contact center. And I think we talk very much about vulnerability of customers, but we also have to understand the vulnerability of the people that are doing the job themselves as well.
Yeah.
Martin Camwell has posed a very interesting question in the chat: is how are you thinking about preparing and supporting frontline colleagues to support the FCA vulnerability requirements? And I think it'd be interesting, Elaine, to get that view from both the customer perspective, but both from the agent's vulnerability perspective as well. So Elaine, over to you with that one.
Okay, so the guidance came out a couple of days ago. I've read it once and I'm going back through with I always work with a yellow highlighter pen and a red pen just to pull out the key elements of it. For me, there wasn't anything substantially different in the guidance from the consultation paper they issued in the summer last year. But I think one of the key messages is around, we mustn't be reliant on customers to self-identify. Actually, it's our responsibility to recognise the signs of a vulnerable circumstance and be able to assess whether that potential is real in this particular instance. So somebody might be living in a vulnerable circumstance, might be financially vulnerable, for example, but actually they're ringing to tell you about a change of address. That doesn't necessarily mean that the vulnerability is relevant in this conversation. So we've got to be able to be a bit more scientific in our understanding and assessments, and we've got to be proactive of that. And therefore, there is an onus within the guidance around organisations taking responsibility for that, and that relies on well-trained staff, well-briefed staff, well-supported staff. But there's also an acceptance, as you just said, that our staff are now working from home and working in different ways than they previously have, with different shift patterns. Some of you at home will be doing what I've been doing this morning and doing a bit of homeschooling and blending how we work. And that creates, or can create, vulnerable circumstances for our staff, which, if we don't recognise, spot and help them to manage, will then be passed on to customers, because the staff will be creating inadvertently vulnerable circumstances for customers by not providing full information, not signposting clearly, or not answering all elements of a question. So we've got to get both elements of this right. And for me, I would start with looking at the customer journeys and reviewing what have we planned to be doing. Has any of that changed as part of COVID? And what is the impact of our decision and our routing on the customer? And also, a subline on that is around what's the impact on our staff members. So it might be that we started a journey and you had to fill in an application online. Okay, well, if our customers can't get online, how do they deal with that? And there was a session I sat in the other day where British Gas, for example, have now reinstated phone numbers on their web pages and on their letters. I can't personally believe they ever took it off. But I think it's about giving channel choice, which Victoria touched on in her first answer.
Yeah, and I think there was an interesting point raised by Anthony Heald in the chat. So thanks very much for that, Anthony. I completely agree with this one. And it leads on to a question from Martin Duke. So Anthony said most companies, or a lot of companies, and I do agree with this because I still hear it when I tune into IVRs, many companies are still using COVID as an excuse for shocking services. So shocking services and or delays in services. So Victoria, I'm going to ask you Martin Duke's question, but I'm going to invite Martin to take himself off mute and fire the question at you. So Martin, take yourself off mute and ask Victoria your question.
Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my question is really around the, and it's based on Anthony's original comment, but it's based on loyalty and whether you think, or whether anybody thinks that there will be any changes to the levels of loyalty. In particular, I'm thinking about organisations. Some organisations have done really well in supporting customers through COVID. Others have been shockingly poor. And I'd just be quite interested to see if there's any perception or any feeling that there may well be change in customers' attitude towards these organisations? Prior to COVID, I was starting to think that loyalty was becoming less important to customers, and they were looking for price and those sort of things. But I would be interested to see if we think loyalty will come back with a greater strength of purpose.
Interesting question, Martin. Victoria, I'll let you take the lead on that.
Thank you. It's a great question, Martin. I think something there's been a lot of debate about. You're absolutely right. There's been, some really polarized examples of businesses who've really emerged as victors through this really challenging time. So faced with the same set of circumstances, they've responded in a completely different way, and shown that real agility and that appetite to still focus on their customer. The other side of the spectrum, there's other businesses, I'm sure we've all got some personal examples where, it's almost been a convenient mask to put on, and they've used the pandemic as almost an excuse to just cover up pre-existing issues and limitations and restrictions on their products and services. So I absolutely think we're living in an era where, we've seen the explosion of digital tools and tech. I'm sure we're all present ourselves on different social media platforms that we talk as customers, we talk to our friends, we talk to our colleagues about our experiences. So there's definitely some real tales. The power of storytelling coming out of some brands which have done particularly well, even when it's down to, furloughing their staff and then paying the money back to the government. That plays to that point I was making earlier about that wider social footprint, how they've treated people, how they're playing their part in society. But there's other businesses. I had a dreadful experience, I'll not name any names, just before Christmas, looking to buy my daughter a laptop, and just had a woeful experience trying to get the right software onto what was quite a basic IT purchase. And I was just passed from pillar to post, and the standard token response, regardless of channel, was just so it's due to the pandemic. And you think, well, hang on, other businesses are all facing into this and have managed to respond in a much more timely and flexible way. So I think the whole notion of loyalty is very closely linked to this wider concept of trust, which I touched on earlier. And I absolutely agree. I think that's definitely in all of our psyches and awareness now, in a way that it perhaps wasn't as prevalent before. So yeah, it's a really good question, Martin, and something I do agree with. I think that whole notion of trust and loyalty is going to become much more important in the wake of these challenging moments.
And you know what, it's interesting, isn't it? It's that whole Maya Angelou quote for me. It's like customers will forget what you said, they might forget what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel. And I think the people that have differentiated themselves within the last 12 months and really kind of focused on the customer experience and how they want their customers to interact with them, even in times of crisis, are going to be one that are heralded in kind of when it comes to either renewal or the next kind of phase in that customer journey. I'm going to ask, I think it was Greg, to take himself off mute, because I think you asked a really good question, and it kind of extends onto the loyalty theme, but I think it's more the loyalty theme in respect to people. And I'm going to ask you to direct this to Elaine, Greg. So take yourself off mute and ask your question, Greg.
Yeah, hi. It was really just an extension of that question of consumer loyalty. I think that it kind of extends past that into the employees as well. And I think a lot of employees have been lent on heavily over this period and perhaps not treated as well as they should have been. And I just feel that as the job market improves and there's more jobs available, whether there'll be an influx of people jumping ship, as it were, and kind of voting with their feet.
I saw your question coming through, Greg, and I thought I agree with Gary. It's a great question. And I think actually there's some parallels between the customer element and the employee element here. It's no longer just about money. I think, from a customer perspective, it's not just about price, but from an employee perspective, it's not just about your salary anymore or your bonus, because you're right, businesses and employees scramble to try and make the best of the situation they found themselves in. And it's been a real challenge, and it's been a long haul. So there's 12 months where some organisations have asked their customers to bear with them. Well, 12 months is quite a long time. And the same is true of employees who are now going through burnout. And I think it's, employees are starting to be asking around a better work from home life balance. They want support. And there was a recent survey, I don't have the numbers to hand because it's in my office at home, from Perkbox, which was talking about, and they've done a survey around what are the benefits that staff are now looking for from two perspectives. One, from those who are working in the office, and the other from those who are now working from home. And, you know, things where if you're in the office, there was a cycle to work scheme or loans around transport. It's not relevant if you're not commuting into the office anymore. But the question on financial support in that frame is now around, well, actually, can I have some support towards my household bills? Can I upgrade my electricity, you know, my internet connection? I need a faster laptop than the one I've got at home. And so it's really worth digging into what are the differences from those working from home and what are from those working in the office and those who are blended. So I, you know, encourage you to talk to your staff and understand it, but actually understand at the beginning of all this that the world has changed, and we are not, unlike Morgan Stanley and some of the banks have announced this morning, not every organisation is going to ask their staff to go back to work. It's time we drop the arrogance about, oh, we know what's best. We have to engage with staff and we have to engage with customers and ask their opinion, because they will have some of the answers. They won't all share 100%. Yes, we all want you know, an allowance, £10 a month allowance for our internet connection or our broadband speed to be upgraded, but they will have trends and thoughts and themes that we can work with as employers. But, you know, I think we have to be mindful that the situation we created has caused our staff and our customers issues. We have to now understand what they mean and how do we now solve them, rather than just hoping that come June 21st we'll all be back to where we were, because it ain't happening.
I think there's a good extension of that response, Elaine, and thanks very much for that. I thought that was a really good response to that question. Nia Mata, I'm going to ask you to take yourself off mute, and I'll have my own views on this one because it's an L&D one. But Nia, if you ask your question, let's see what Victoria's got to say with this, and then I'll jump on with any additional builds. So over to you, Nia.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Really excited by this discussion. So a topic fond to my heart is around learning and development. I would really love to hear your opinion around how digital training has been transforming the CX experience and what trends you might be seeing from that.
Do you want me to go first, Gary?
You go, and I'll fill in any blanks or anything else.
All right, okay. Yeah, it's a great question. I think, like most functions, L&D is a prime example of a function that truly has to use a modern day word, pivot to this new way of interacting and engaging with either new recruits to a business or existing members of staff who are perhaps going through some upskilling or cross-skilling. So obviously, in the absence of being able to physically be together, the whole deployment model has moved to one that's done remotely and using all the sort of plethora of digital tools and platforms that we're very lucky, I think, now to have access to. I've heard some great feedback from businesses who've been able to recruit and onboard entire new teams, all doing it remotely using these digital tools. And I think it's shown that there's still that benefit in that community, with people going through similar stages of their learning journey coming together, but in a digital way. But you've still got that opportunity to break out and have one-on-one learning, etc., with the person that's delivering the training. But I think necessity is the mother of invention. I think it's a quote I've used a few times over the last 12 months. And in this situation where we've not really got any option but to be a part, we have to move to that new style. So I think it's largely been managed very successfully. And because we've now got that playbook of new recruits, existing members of staff being trained and upskilled in that way, there's a greater confidence as to how that will apply in future training models going forward. I think we've also identified some other ways in which people can learn. It's not always through formal training, but how do you buddy up members of your team? How do you look at peer-to-peer coaching, which has multi-benefits? It doesn't just help the person that's perhaps needing to be upskilled and needing some extra support. It also has some great engagement benefits from the person who's tasked with that responsibility to buddy and share their knowledge and experience. So yes, it's absolutely had to change. I'm sure, like many of the changes that have been made in the last 12 months, some of those changes will have some longevity in future ways of working. But as and when restrictions will lift, I'm sure there will be parts of that training and engagement model which, based on feedback and individual experience, might shift back to that sort of face-to-face, human-to-human model.
And I think you're spot on, and I know Elaine will have some thoughts on this as well. But I'm working with a charity at the moment that's delivering customer service training to a cohort of 50 people, and the design that's had to go into that, and the thought process around what makes a good digital learning engagement has been really, really key in terms of thinking about the amount of time that people can sit in front of their screens, learning information, absorbing that, and that kind of whole Zoom fatigue has been a really key one. But I think you are right in terms of people, necessity being the mother of invention, because I think if you asked me what a breakout room was just over 12 months ago, I'd have said maybe prison, but now it's you're using breakout rooms. People are using Google for things like Jamboards, Miro, brilliant way of getting people to interact virtually by having more control of digital solutions. So I think it's definitely coming on. The biggest challenge, I think, in the L&D space is how to make sure that you onboard somebody in the right way, and then you support them in the training and competency framework that sits alongside that, and actually give yourselves a bit more breathing space when it comes to workforce management and workforce planning, to say that your speed to competence for those people that are going to be enrolled is going to be slightly longer. So allow for that rather than expecting them to be firing all cylinders within the first 6 weeks into the role. Elaine, would you have any extra builds on that?
Yeah, just a little, and I've had to go through it myself in terms of one of our offerings is vulnerability training around recognising vulnerable customers and making reasonable adjustments. And we used to do it in a classroom environment where we would have 20 different organisations, and of course we couldn't run that in that way, and we had to. So what we did, rather than just shoving the slides online and saying, here, download it and work it out for yourself, or making it into a webinar, we had to take it apart and think about how do we present that information and what's the experience of learning. So if you're in a classroom environment, yes, there might be some PowerPoint slides on the screen, but there's also some interactive parts and ways of learning. You're also looking at the presenter much more. So it's not about just putting your slides on screen and talking through them. You have to actually, you might flip a slide up, but then take it away again. And it's and because they're coming to see you, and they're here from the expert or the trainer in the room, they want to be able to pick your brains. And if they can't see your face, they can't engage. So most of our messages are communicated through body language, and our hands and our voices and our tone, and so you just have to stop and think about, how do I want to communicate this message given the tools that I now have available to me, and then piece it back together. But slamming it online and saying, it's now a digital course, you can download it and do it at your own pace, won't work.
I think there's a couple of great questions in the chat, and they link very closely to agent performance and agent ability. And I'm going to come to Tracy Finlay next, so I'm going to let yourself prepare yourself to get yourself off mute, and then we'll come to Jane Morris, because Jane's also asked a great question. So Tracy, I'll let you take yourself off mute and fire your question to whichever panelist you'd like to direct it at.
I don't mind which one, but I have felt strongly for quite some time that with the advancements in technology and AI and stuff like that, all the churn that agents have previously had to deal with can be moved on to something like AI, and then intelligent FAQs, all the great stuff that's the machine learning and everything else, and then agents. The actual role of the contact center agent can become much, much more interesting. But the point I've just put in notes actually is that, of course, we need to continue to give customers the choice, whether or not they want to do it digitally or whether or not they want to speak to somebody. Different people have different needs, but I'm quite excited about the potential future of the contact center agent being much more interesting, and they can help grow with feedback and that sort of thing, because they know the customer more than anybody does.
Yeah, and I think that it's a really interesting point, that, Tracy, and I think I think Victoria will probably have some really strong views on this. I've got my own thoughts around how we can make agents super, because I think it leads on to a very key point around your recruitment strategy and the type of person that you're recruiting. But Victoria, I'll come to you first, and then Elaine, any builds from yourself after Victoria.
Okay, thanks, Gary, and a really, really brilliant question, Tracy. I'm sure something everyone on this call today has had the opportunity to reflect on. I absolutely believe that, the advancement in technology, the plethora of new digital tools and channels that have opened up actually can really work in a complementary way with the role of the agents. I know there's been some debate on previous platforms and discussions just around, you know, are the robots taking our jobs? Well, yes, actually, they will be able to free up some capacity because they're able to handle some of that repetitive, more mundane, more binary sort of yes, no response. And what that does in turn is create that capacity within your operational teams where you've got people who perhaps there's further investment in empathy, rapport building to really help customers with those moments that matter, those critical moments of truth in the customer journey where there's really no comparison to the help and reassurance that an actual human person can give them. So my view is, you know, they can very much work in a complementary way, but it's about being really clear on the appropriate channels and the appropriate journeys for each customer interaction, and recognizing that different customers will have different preferences around how they interact. And again, we come back to that sort of element of choice. I think for contact centres as a whole, this has been a really exciting time, if there is such a thing, in the midst of the pandemic. I think as other frontline teams have literally had to shut up shop and staff have been furloughed, the contact centres have really become like the stalwart of any organisation as businesses quickly mobilise their teams to work remotely, giving them the tools and tech to really provide that seamless experience to customers. But I think it's then become that gateway for any business into understanding the voice of the customer and the customer experience. So it really, in a sense, for me, elevates the contact centre function as a whole to be a more strategic part of any organisational structure, but also elevates the role of the contact centre agent because they are that key interface with the customer, whether they're interacting with customers across digital channels or speaking on a one-on-one basis. There's a real onus and opportunity for contact centre employees to really elevate and amplify that voice of the customer to really help inform and influence the wider business around the opportunities and customer experience and customer journeys that can be improved. So I think it's a really exciting time. I think the role of the contact centre agent has been discussed for many years now, but I think now is we're really a bit of a sort of tipping point that we can see how the digital channels and the human channels can coexist and really complement each other.
Definitely, I'd agree with that. And I think there's some really great technology coming down the line, Tracy, that I've seen and implemented in other organisations, which is around vScreen, so the ability to have video chat and have that in a compliant, recorded way. I think the biggest challenge, and certainly the challenges that I saw in previous companies, was the resistance from the agent not wanting to interact in that way. So I think there's a type of person that might need to be recruited for that, and a very upfront conversation with those people that you're recruiting to say, this is the role of the job now. It's much more digital. It's much more face-to-face communication rather than what people traditionally see as the telephony role, being strapped to a headset all day. So I think that could be an interesting dynamic. Elaine, any other thoughts on Tracy's question? Then we'll come to Jane Morris.
Yeah, so like you, Tracy, and Victoria and Gary, actually, I think I'm really excited about this because I think this is a moment in time where we can stop thinking about the contact centre teams as being almost robots. It's a really skilled job. It takes a good talent. It takes understanding. And I think the last 12 months have almost showcased those skills because actually there's been huge flexibility in that workforce. They've been willing and they have adapted. Some of them in a slightly more terrified way about going on screen, on VChat and things like that. But actually, we've become much more comfortable with some of that technology. But for me, tech is there to support the agent to deliver the best experience. It's not there to replace it and do it for it, unless it's really simple and it can be a good experience for both the customer and the organisation to have it automated. But I think the human in this, and that's where the skill of the agent comes in, is understanding the nuances about what they're being asked and the way it's being asked, and actually unpicking what it is the customer is asking or wanting to do. And therefore, I think we have to remember that whilst marketing perceive themselves as being the voice of the customer in their push messages going out, the contact centre agents are the voice of the customer in those one-to-one relationships. So I think this is a great moment, and we've got to sort of grab it with both hands and demonstrate how much value we add. And I've seen a couple of questions in there about cost centres and all sorts of things coming through, but a brilliantly skilled contact centre adds so much value to the business and the bottom line that it cannot be ignored.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point because we were chatting about that in a different networking meeting. Say, are you a profit centre or are you a value center? And I think you take very different decisions around average handling time, wrap, and all those things when you're trying to do it from a profit perspective. So that's a whole new networking meeting, I think. Jane, interesting in terms of the line that we're going down there in terms of value, though. You've got a question around performance management in the contact center. So ask your question.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gary. I wanted to ask the panel about performance management. So given the fact that people are working at home and we're trying to be supportive, that we're doing homeschooling and we've got other, considerations, how are we managing performance of agents, and, how are we keeping them engaged to perform and then increasing that performance as well?
So before we fire this to any of the panelists, I'm going to ask any of the operational leaders on the call, and I know there's quite a few of them, what are you doing to help support manage performance in the contact center? So any kind of tips or any thoughts that you have, share them in the chat, and then Jane can absorb some of those. But I'm going to come to Elaine first with that as a question. What's your thoughts?
I mean, it's definitely more of a challenge than it has been. I don't have a team myself in that sense, so I'm sort of relying on working with my insight comes from my clients. But I think in terms of how we manage it, we again have to stop and look at what the performance management tools that we've had previously and whether they're still relevant or not. Don't just blindly keep going and hope that somehow it'll sort itself out. But we have to keep them engaged. And I know a number of organisations have introduced not just mental health, but well-being members of the team who are checking in on their staff. And we touched on it a little bit earlier around staff vulnerability. So if performance is beginning to dip and we see it in the numbers, we've got to understand why and not just say, oh, well, they're slacking off. I know that Goldman Sachs' view is you've got to be in the office, otherwise you're not performing. And therefore, we have to have you working where we can see you. We have to have this relationship of trust. And, our staff have earned that over the last year. They've delivered, they've consistently done that. They're probably going through a bit of burnout. And so they're tired or they're stressed or they're facing different challenges. So we have to unpick that and understand it. And they're different than the ones they would have faced in the office. So I think we need to examine that. And then about keeping them engaged, it's not just about throwing a quiz on a Friday night or having a team Zoom with beers. It's much more than that now. We need to understand, but we talk about personalization from a customer perspective. We have to understand our staff on a one-to-one level too. So I think for me, those would be my kind of guiding principles, really. Understand the performance, but understand the drivers of the change of that performance and what's causing it and how do you best support that. And if you don't have the skills in-house, buy them in. But also you've got to keep them engaged. So you need to understand what drivers and motivations each of your staff members have. And that's where your team leaders can come into play and your contact centre supervisors. It's a team effort to get to the bottom of that, but share that knowledge amongst the team.
Yeah. And I think what I've observed from some of the conversations that I've had, certainly from leaders that have come onto any of the events that I've been on, is communication has been probably the biggest challenge from their perspective as leaders. In terms of that communication overwhelm, so they're getting WhatsApps from all different areas of the business, from the teams, from team managers, from other areas of the business, and actually trying to cut through some of that nonsense and actually get to the core nub of people's problems. So I know a lot of technology like Slack's been introduced. I think people have started to kind of plot things on Twilio and things like that. So using technology as a means to help engineer some of those conversations has been an interesting one. Victoria, have you observed anything from any of the clients or any of the people that you've been speaking to?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with everything you've both said there. One other practical thing that I think is often understated in terms of the impact it can have on contact centre employees' engagement and motivation is just, again, playing back to this notion of flexibility. So with people now working from home, the whole notion of a fixed 9-to-5 shift that, is often the bane of any agent's life, no longer really applies. So there's much more flexibility and creativity that can be built into your scheduling, introducing micro power shifts at busy points in the day that maybe coincide with when your kids are perhaps going to be, homeschooled and engaged with their teachers, and people are able to commit to an hour here and an hour there. as opposed to really having to be heads down, headset on, and be engaged in customer interactions all day, which is super stressful when you've got kids and dogs and cats running around at home. So I think for me that notion of flexibility, allowing your people to sort of self-select shifts, allowing them to swap shifts with their colleagues, and looking at the working day in a sort of through a different lens now, I think that can have a big bearing on people's sense of being able to juggle all these different balls that we're being asked to juggle, and that in turn plays into their engagement and how they then interact with your customers. But you know, I think the whole notion of communication, you know, that is something that needs to be really we need to double down on. When you're not able to see people physically, communication is super important. But that's just one practical thing I would suggest that people could look at.
Yeah, and I think Maurizio's made a few comments around that as well in the chat, so it'd be interesting to have a look at some of his comments in the chat with regards to how that social aspect works its way through. I want to ask a question around tech, and more specifically around AI, and how we can get that customer technology piece right, because I think one of the things that I've seen certainly on LinkedIn has been very busy, if you like. There's been lots of conversation around there about poor AI experiences, poor chatbot experiences, and how that affects the overall ability to communicate with the customer. And I'd be interested, either Victoria and or Elaine, is any examples have you seen of good AI experiences, and how we bridge the gap on some of those poorer ones? So Victoria, come to you first on that.
Yeah, so I think it plays to the point I was making earlier, that people sort of see it's like AI versus humans. And actually, I come from a mindset that I think the two can coexist and really complement each other. And it's actually the exploration and explosion of these digital tools and tech that are helping to create some of that capacity in already stretched workforces when customer demand has been really high. So I see it as playing a really complementary role. What I think is really critical is understanding the key points in your customer journey where it's appropriate to have AI versus where it's more appropriate to have more of that empathetic human interaction. I had a personal example just before Christmas. My daughter is soon to be a teenager, so an interesting time in our household, and she wanted, I don't know if anyone's familiar with that, Nike Air Force trainers, but she didn't want any ones. She wanted customized ones, which were an absolute nightmare to get ordered from the Nike website. This all coincided with the whole sort of EU agreement going through, and you know, all the hold up at all the ports. So I was constantly chasing up Nike to see what's happened to my daughter's trainers, and I was constantly just interfacing with, it was all digital channels, and it was bots that I was interacting with, and I had a brilliant experience. I mean, probably because I'm a bit more savvy and au fait with customer service and how it's provided across different channels, I could tell it was a bot, but they still were able to give me the response that I needed in a timely manner. And actually, when you're just looking for something that's convenient and yes, no, I think that really works. And as I say, helps create that capacity for some of your more complex interactions where it's not just a binary response and you need a bit more exploration. So yeah, I had a great experience there. I'm sure there are other extremes and other examples where it's not been properly thought through. And I think what I would say is it's not about just having the channel and ticking the Me Too box. It's about understanding what's the customer experience and customer outcome we're looking to deliver, and how does technology actually enable and support that objective, as opposed to we need this channel, we need this tech, tick the box, therefore job done. It has to completely, in my mind, be grounded in the customer experience that you're looking to shape and deliver.
And I was on a webinar recently about human-centered design, and that was exactly the principle there. Is so what does your customer want? How does it impact the journey? What's the driver for it in terms of that interaction? And how do you make the customer the center point of all of your decision making when it comes to technology? Elaine, do you have any additional builds on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, there was a Gartner survey out not long ago around 70% of customers from organisations surveyed were using self-service channels at some point during their resolution journey. So you kind of think, oh, that sounds impressive. Lots of automations coming in there, but only 9% of those customers surveyed actually got a full resolution. So I think, Victoria, you were one of the lucky ones. But it's interesting that there has been, I think part of it is that accelerated push online because of COVID. Back to, it's almost full circle where we started, but you know, people had to put solutions in place to try and take some of the noise off and some of the pressure off the voice conversations with a skeleton staff or a dispersed contact centre staff, plus massively increased volume. So I think some of these things went in a rush, and we're hoping that they would learn, and they need refining. And one of the things that I'm working on now as part of my role as a co-chair of the Direct Marketing Association Vulnerable Working Group is working with the DMA's Contact Centre Council and producing some guidelines around how organisations can best employ that choice of channel, including AI and chatbots and all of that. And just thinking about how, from a vulnerable customer perspective, that can either help or be a hindrance. And it's about how we use that technology to help customers where it's possible, but also give them a route out if it's not working for them. And I've seen, you know, I've seen a comment in the chat saying that all customers are unique and they have different needs and considerations and ways of asking questions. So we've just got to be able to reflect that and not just keep forcing them down the funnel saying, well, you've got to do this. This is your only choice. We must open the channel choice out, would be my kind of thought. Yeah, and that is coming out soon. So keep your eyes open. I'll put it on my LinkedIn.
I think that's a really good point. I think it was Anthony Hill that mentioned getting caught in that loop of chatbot hell is a problem. I think we've got time for one last question, and I'm going to ask this one. It's I talk quite often about customer experience and how sometimes it can be quite theoretical. I've got a question for both of you now, which is more around the practical element of CX and how do we really turn customer experience into a practical application of fixing things for the customer? And what would you say are some of the biggest practical things that we can do to deliver a great customer experience? And I'm going to come to Victoria first for that.
Gosh, I think that there's so much that can be done. I touched on earlier just around, I think, the increased significance of contact centres in the wider organisational ecosystem. So I think there's a real opportunity for contact centre leaders to really look at extracting that insight they have around the customer experience from all the multitude of channels that customers are interacting on and positioning that back to the wider business. So I actually spoke in a previous webinar about what it means to be a successful contact centre leader in 2021. And I think it's that sort of two-hatted approach of managing and leading your teams, engaging with your teams, understanding that your people are being there for your customers, actually quickly facing internally into your wider business to start to circulate and amplify, as I've said before, that voice of the customer. So it's not just something that sits within the bubble of contact centres, but it's actually been shared and fed back into the wider business so that collectively, you know, you can help to work through the different silos, break down the different team divides and get everyone unified on actually, here's what our customers are saying. Now, what are we going to do about it in the short term? And then what are the wider sort of transformation opportunities that we as a business need to look into? So I think really using this moment to amplify that voice of the customer, share that customer insight across the business.
Brilliant. And I think the key point within that, and I've seen it happen in a lot of organizations where we take that voice of the customer, but don't actually use it as actionable intelligence to drive specific change. So I think that's a really important point. Elaine, any final thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'm totally with you both in terms of using the voice of the customer. And my top tip would be, I know that's where we're going next, is give you a nice segue into that top tips bit. But around looking from the outside in, we will gather lots of data in our conversations and our emails and our live chat conversations and social media channels, and we can pull what the customer is saying into that. But often one of the traps we fall into is in trying to interpret that from our perspective of to what the customer is trying to say. And so we put a spin on it, or we give ourselves an excuse. Oh, well, the website keeps going to, oh, well, we know that, but that's not a big problem. And I had this with a client the other day who they're taking donations online through a charity, and we run a mystery shopping program, and I'll just touch on that slightly. But one of our auditors had come across trying to place a donation, and the website crashed. And their gut reaction was, oh, well, the website goes down every now and again. He was going to give you money and he doesn't know whether it's gone through or not. It's left him with a really dodgy impression of you as an organisation. This is affecting your brand value. Oh, but yeah, that happens all the time. It's important to your donors and your customers. So if you try and excuse what your customers or the criticisms they're sharing with you, you're doing yourselves a disservice. So you've got to look honestly and openly and look at the response from both time, how quickly do you get back to them, and how fully is the content of your answer? How much of an explanation are you giving, or how much signposting, how much guidance are you giving? And we've got to answer all the questions that they're asking, not just the first one in the list and hoping that they'll go away because we're focused on average handling time. So.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That was a really great session, guys. I think I'm just going to share my screen for the final couple of slides so we can wrap up. So this has been a really, really great discussion, and thank you very much to Victoria and Elaine for joining. I do have a small survey that I'd love you all to complete, just to kind of give some thoughts and feedback on any of the sessions that we've gone. If you would like a one-to-one with any of the speakers, drop it into that. That is in the chat now, so you can complete that. So please do take a minute to complete the survey. And more specifically, if there is anything that you'd like us to bring to these events so that we can kind of share and have this similar discussion. There's also a practical CX handbook that I've produced for this session, which I'll drop into the chat as a file. Feel free to download that. It's absolutely free. And it's just the Fab Solutions thoughts on how you can create a practical guide of customer experience, improving your customer experience through taking practical action. So feel free to have a look at that at your leisure. The next event is going to be on the 25th of March, and we're focusing on the use of AI in the contact center, automation and gamification. So we've got a chap called David Naylor, who's going to be joining that, who's an AI specialist. And we've also got the Modular Analytics Company who are joining as well. And they look at predictive analysis of AI and how you can make different decisions using predictive and data analytics. So it should be a really interesting question, and we'll probably do it in a similar layout in terms of having this discussion. So if you've got any thoughts around AI automation, or if you're working on your existing strategy and you want some support advice on how to improve that, come along to next month's session. They're live on Eventbrite now, so you can have a look at those and book on. I'd love to see you there. Last thing to say is thank you very much to Elaine. Thank you very much to Victoria. Thank you everybody for joining. It's been a really great lively discussion. The chat has been on fire with some awesome stuff. So I'm going to wade through that and share people's tips. And if there's any questions that we didn't get to, I will come back to you all with thoughts from me and the panel. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure hosting today's event. Take care, everybody.
Gary.
Thanks
Cheers.
a lot. I'll let you all dial off. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.